afternoon, everyone. My name is Heather Metcalf, and I am Chief Research Officer for the Association for Women in Science and PI for the ARC Network grant. Thank you all for registering for this third installment of our ARC Network webinar series. It's really exciting to see so many people registering and coming to hear about the work that we're supporting through this program. Before we begin, I want to take care of a few housekeeping items. So first, I want to let you all know that this webinar is being recorded so that we can make it available to everyone who registered who may not have had a chance to come and attend while we're actually presenting the webinar. We will also be uploading and recording, uploading the recording to the ARC Network community platform as well. So you'll be able to access this afterwards. We've placed everyone who's coming into the meeting on mute, and there are a couple of mechanisms within the Zoom platform that you can use for asking questions. So if you go down to the bottom of your Zoom window, there's a section, when you hover there, it'll show a couple of menus. One of them is Q&A and the other one is chat. In the Q&A, we'd like people to place questions that they have throughout the presentation, and we'll make sure that we cover those at the end, and I'll moderate those for Cara. We also have the chat box function, as I mentioned, that you can click on and send any technical questions that you might have if you're having difficulty with Zoom, so that we can help you with that. On the far left side of your Zoom window is where your microphone and video settings and speaker settings are. So if you're having any trouble hearing or want to turn your video on, those are the places to check to make sure that your settings are appropriate. I also want to share a little bit about the ARC Network and our Virtual Visiting Scholars program that's supporting Cara's work. The goal of the ARC Network is to create and cultivate broad community that bridges the gap between researchers and practitioners, and also enables the sharing of resources that are often developed in institutional silos. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advance program, and the Association for Women in Science serves as the backbone organization supporting these efforts. Throughout our Virtual Visiting Scholars program, we focus on promoting and curating research on gender equity and STEM by funding meta-analyses on topics to synthesize existing gender equity research and data sets that have foundational literature, and using that to develop ideas for research frontiers. We're grateful to our ARC research board members, led by ARC co-PI Joan Herbers, who's also on this call, for their work in spearheading the Virtual Visiting Scholars program. You can learn more about the ARC Network on the website and encourage you to visit it at equityandstem.org. Now, we are here today to talk about Cara's fantastic research. Dr. Cara Margherio conducted meta-analysis, metasynthesis work on mentoring experiences of women faculty of color. She's an assistant director of the University of Washington Center for Evaluation and Research and manages the evaluation of NSF and NIH-funded projects, primarily working with national professional development programs for early career academics belonging to groups underrepresented in STEM. I'm thrilled to turn it over to Cara and to have her share her work with you all.
Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you to the ARC Network community for supporting this work. So as Heather mentioned, I will be presenting today a metasynthesis of the mentoring experiences of women of color faculty. But first, I just want to acknowledge that women of color is part of a US framework that may or may not be recognized in other parts of the world. So this term is referring to women who are not white, acknowledging a common experience of racism within the United States. Women of color make up approximately 18% of the US population, but they're less than 7% of the tenured faculty within STEM fields. So today, I'll give an overview of the theoretical frameworks within mentoring research, and then discuss my methods and data before presenting the emergent themes that make up my findings. Finally, I'll discuss some of the theoretical implications of these findings before opening the floor to a broader discussion. But first, a brief introduction. So we've been trying to diversify and to improve diversity at the faculty level and in STEM in particular, for a very long time. We've spent decades on this. There have been a lot of interventions and associated research programs that have developed around these efforts. And mentoring for women faculty has been one of the key areas of focus. Mentoring is associated with a whole host of positive outcomes, as you can see here, from improved networking, research productivity, retention, tenure, and promotion, self-efficacy, confidence, and empowerment, and even sense of belonging and socialization into faculty life. There are additional benefits, such as increased career satisfaction. I could only fit so many items onto one slide, so these are some of the more commonly cited ones. This is amazing. One activity, mentoring, and it's able to produce all of these positive outcomes for women faculty. Seems like all we need to do is encourage women faculty to find a mentor, maybe set up a few mentoring programs, and we'll be ready to diversify our STEM faculty in no time. So what's the problem? Very few studies on women faculty and mentoring disaggregate by race and ethnicity. So consequently, while supposedly being representative of all women, this research is truly only representative of white women who make up the numerical majority of women in STEM fields. All of the studies in the prior slide were focused on women faculty, but none disaggregated their data to look specifically at women of color faculty. Now, there are various valid reasons why authors might choose not to disaggregate their data. So in a small N qualitative study, authors might be reluctant to fully disaggregate data for confidentiality reasons. With a quantitative study, researchers may be reluctant to disaggregate due to concerns about reduced statistical power. Those are just two hypothetical reasons. So it may be reasonable on a case-by-case basis, but when it becomes a pattern, what is the impact? What is the cost? So without disaggregation, this research is erasing the experiences of women of color. This notion of the erasure of women of color is grounded in an intersectionality framework. So intersectionality is a way of understanding the world as shaped by multiple axes of power, race, gender, class, ability, that dynamically interact. This grows out of women of color feminist work, and these multiple axes are reflected through our individual experiences of inequities. So at the individual level, our experiences tend to be shaped by multiple axes of power and aspects of our identities at any one point in time. Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality, has written multiple pieces specifically about the erasure of women of color within both feminist work and anti-racist scholarship and activism. So that is the foundation that this research project is building upon. Centering the research focus on women of color faculty not only addresses the erasure of their experiences from earlier work, but also creates opportunities to enrich theoretical concepts, adding nuance to social theory and shedding light on previously overlooked factors. So what is this body of theory around mentoring that I'm looking to enrich? So first of all, what is mentoring? What are the definitions used in the research? Traditionally, and going back to Cram's groundbreaking work in 1985, the mentoring has been understood to provide two functions. Career support, and so this is all aspects of career development, items that focus on career or academic advancement, including skill building, networking, visibility, and also psychosocial support, friendship, counseling, items that have to do with personal development. Now, more recent literature has added role modeling as a distinct and separate function into which the mentor provides examples of behavior to emulate. The mentoring itself may look in different ways and there may be different structures. So traditionally, we think of mentoring as a dyad. And when you hear mentoring, this might be the first model that pops into your head for a lot of people. This is a traditional guru model where you have one person who meets all of your needs. Generally agreed today that's a bit outdated. It's unlikely to find one mentor who can meet all of your needs. Research-wise, the shift went from dyad to team mentoring, where you have one mentor with a number of mentees. So like in graduate school or in a postdoc position where you have a PI who might be mentoring all of their advisees. More recent work has turned to mentoring networks, which recognizes a constellation of concurrent mentoring relationships. This line of research has really pulled in social network theory and looks at, for example, network diversity and tie strength. And then most recently, researchers have also been focusing on peer mentoring, in which no senior mentors are participating. So there's a lot of different structures, and the move has been towards looking at networking. Well, the theories themselves, there are a lot of theories around how mentoring works, what types of benefits it bestows, the different stages mentoring relationships progress through, etc. In Dominguez and Hager's literature review of mentoring networks, they sort the theoretical frameworks into 3 categories. So that's what I'll be presenting today. And we get into the discussion section, we can talk about some of these theories in more detail, but the first one is developmental. And so this is some of the earliest research on mentoring, where folks cycle through looking at different periods of their life cycle development, developmental stages, and how that impacts an individual's mentoring needs. The second category of mentoring theories focus on learning theories. So these focus on the behavioral processes employed by the mentee to facilitate personal progress. This includes a wide range of different types of theories, including behaviorist, cognitivist, constructivist, action learning. They all focus on how the mentee learns and develops. And the third and most recent category of mentoring theories is social, which focuses on the relationships, the networks, the socialization. These theories often pull in theoretical frameworks from other fields, such as social network analysis, but also different types of social capital frameworks and social exchange theories. In addition to all of this, researchers have also looked at how mentoring relates to career development theoretical models, such as social cognitive career theory and the tripartite integration model of social influence. So there's a lot of theorizing going on. It's pulling from a lot of disciplines, including education and learning sciences, organizational management, psychology, and sociology. And as discussed in the beginning, much of this theoretical work is based on research that centers white folks and erases the experience of women of color faculty. So how does this project go about addressing that? So I'm using a metasynthesis. And this is a qualitative approach to a qualitative meta-study. A metasynthesis integrates patterns and insights across qualitative studies. This approach has an interpretive rather than aggregating intent. So the process requires preserving meaning from the original articles while identifying relational links across studies and digging into the meaning of emergent themes. Careful attention is given to contradictory findings. The process is meant to open up spaces for new understandings to emerge, reveal layers and relationships that can't be gleaned from an individual study. I also use a grounded theory approach when it comes to the data analysis, and specifically a type of grounded theory that is known as abductive analysis. So in common with a variety of forms of grounded theory, this involves simultaneous data collection and analysis. The analytic codes and categories are derived directly from the data. Throughout the analysis process, memos are written, which are analytic notes to help explicate the categories. And what's unique about abductive is there are iterative moves between data, coding, and theory. So this key distinction helps you to really make sure that you're speaking to theory and enriching theory. The first step of a metasynthesis begins with data collection. So I conducted 29 unique searches using a variety of search terms that included mentoring women of color and faculty, mentoring minority women faculty. I used terms invoking specific racial and ethnic categories. I also used terms invoking specific disciplinary categories. After 29 searches, I stopped finding any new information and felt fully saturated. I reviewed the first 100 to 200 items of each search. Some searches turned up less than 200, which is why I was not able to review the full 200. And at this stage, reviewed the title and abstract to determine potential inclusion. And I also used the citation snowball method, where I looked at all of the articles that made the shortlist, what had they cited and what cited them. And these all made, well, my long list of studies. The next step was to decide on inclusion criteria. So the inclusion criteria needs to be large enough to include enough studies to do the analysis, which is a maximum of about 10 studies, but small enough to ensure comparability within the data set. By limiting it to 10 studies, you really allow for deep analysis and interpretation with a very qualitative bent. So in order to be included, the studies needed to be qualitative, focus on the faculty mentoring experiences of women of color faculty within STEM fields or academia more broadly. I did open it up to academia more broadly to ensure enough articles. On point number 3 here, though, I would have included studies that were on women or people of color if they had disaggregated by either race or by gender. I couldn't find a single study that met the other criteria and disaggregated their results. So in the end, I ended up with 8 articles in my data set. 4 of these specifically focus on African American or Black women. I use whatever racial and ethnic terms the studies use when discussing them. 3 focus on women of color, and 1 is on Native American women. The disciplinary scope, 3 are women in academia in general, 2 are specific to women in academic administration, and then 1 each in engineering, medicine, and psychology. All of the studies were published between 2001 and 2015, and all were based in the US. I didn't put any restrictions on publication date or country, although the article did need to be in English for me to be able to analyze it. I simply didn't find anything outside of those dates or country. The studies range in scope from 1 institution, that's 2. 1 study is on Hispanic serving institutions, 1 is on a 4-year predominantly white institution, and 2 are on colleges and universities based throughout New York State, and finally 1 study is nationwide. So topically they're comparable. We know that from the inclusion criteria, but what about their methods? So of the 8 articles in the data set, all of them use interviews, including secondary analysis of interview data, and 1 also presents open-ended survey responses. They describe their methods in various ways, as you can see from these tables. So 3 use the term emergent coding, and 1 constant comparison. Those are both typically references to grounded theory approaches. 1 uses narrative analysis, 1 is phenomenology, 1 is specifically program evaluation around a mentoring program, and in 1, none is given. Although they do describe what they do, they use a mixed methods approach. Because this is the one that uses the open-ended surveys. They don't actually describe their coding procedures. And then I also looked at discipline of the first author. I was interested to see if there was a relationship between the disciplinary background and the methods or the findings, which there wasn't. I didn't find much of a relation there, although I will say that the 2 articles written by first authors in sociology both used emergent coding. And then we have 3 that are by folks from education and 1 each from communication, medicine, and psychology. So there's quite a variety here throughout the data set. So now we can discuss the emergent findings. So what did these have to say? What do they have in common, and where do they contradict? First, frames are used in the front end of a paper to situate the study within a larger body of literature. How the authors choose to package and present the issues at hand. What are they trying to focus the reader's attention on? Every single study utilized underrepresentation of women of color in academia as the central framing device in the front end, which is also what I did in the beginning of this presentation. And they all discuss it as a challenge and as a barrier. However, the studies also discussed it as a source of power and a space for resistance. And 1 study argued that women of color are causing systemic change by resisting assimilation. So the second theme, is conceptions of mentoring. How are they defining it? 4 of the studies gave explicit definitions of mentoring, and 4 did not. 4 just referred to mentoring and never defined it, never operationalized it. In discussing their findings, all of the papers do explicitly note the first two aspects of mentoring I mentioned at the beginning, skill-based and psychosocial support. So this is in line with traditional approaches to mentoring research. All but one of the studies also discussed role modeling throughout their finding sections and how participants talked about their mentoring experiences, but how this frame was used varied considerably. So in one study, it was considered a separate or third function of mentoring. In another, it was subsumed as a type of psychosocial support. In a third, it was engaged by the authors in the discussion section. In another paper that had no definition of mentoring, the authors used the term role model interchangeably with mentor. While in yet another study with no definition, the participants spoke of role modeling as a separate concept from mentoring. They also had differences in how mentoring was structured and how they understood the structures. So two of the papers restricted mentoring to traditional dyad. In both of these papers, none of the participants had experience in mentoring relationship. However, the authors restricted the definition of a mentoring relationship to one with someone who is further along in a career similar to yours, perhaps in administration, who counsels you and looks out for your career. This excludes peer mentors or mentors that may exist outside of academia. And indeed, in the data set that they present, the women spoke to having mentors that simply didn't fit this definition. All of the studies do note the value of having multiple mentors, including mentors outside of one's field, in terms of how the participants discuss benefits of mentoring. So the next emergent theme looks at impacts of mentoring. How are these women being impacted by their mentoring relationships? Every single study concluded in their discussion section with affirmations of the value of mentoring, even those two in which participants didn't have any of the formal access to mentoring. The most common benefits of mentoring were navigational capital and problem solving or advice. One of the studies also presented evidence that mentoring can lead to systemic change. About half of the studies presented data on the challenges that their participants experienced within mentoring relationships, including contentious relationships with their mentor, and a general sense that mentoring is mysterious and not understood. So there's conflicting results. Even though the authors conclude, this is great, the participants spoke a lot about their struggles. They also spoke about their struggles to find mentors who are also women of color, challenges that occurred in their mentoring relationships despite sharing an identity when they did find someone else who was a woman of color, challenges also of working with mentors who were white men, and also benefits of working with mentors who are white men. So all of this say that it was very complex. And while all of the studies said that it was potentially beneficial for folks to have at least one mentor who shared in their identity, there was no agreement across the study at all around the costs and benefits of working with mentors who had dominant identities. So our next theme is dominant culture and marginality. So in line with the framing of underrepresentation, the papers identify women of color as located on the margins of academia. And they discuss how this location in and of itself can be disruptive to dominant culture and norms. So when your position is on the margins, it can be a lot easier to see both dominant culture and structural inequality. That very act of seeing and that awareness can then become a tool to change the system. As is shown in the quote I have here from one of the studies, as more women of color enter the professoriate and serve in leadership roles, they challenge existing epistemologies and resist superficial assimilation while developing innovative practices and supportive networks to overcome these barriers. Lastly, for the themes, there was very limited intersectionality in the papers. So while all of the articles discussed unique experiences of women of color, academic rank was the only other social identity that was consistently addressed. Most of the studies did not note any other aspects. So 3 discussed immigration status or nationality, only 2 noted age, 1 noted relationship status. But these were all given as characteristics of the group. Nothing was broken down at the individual level. Only 2 studies mentioned social identities of participants at the individual level, linking findings to individual people, which meant that as my metasynthesis, I couldn't engage in the intersectionality because I wasn't given that information. Even discussing being women of color, identities were still often discussed along a single axis, even in terms of race and gender. So those are the themes that emerged from the data set. But what does that mean? What are the theoretical implications? Well, there's a lack of consensus around defining mentoring. And this really highlights the need to clarify the conceptual model of mentoring. Is role modeling a distinct function of mentoring, or is it a distinct concept altogether? Or is it just kind of subsumed in those other functions? The wide variety of definitions and operationalizations of the concept of mentoring gives evidence of the lack of consensus over how we think of mentoring. More work needs to be done to clarify this concept. This lack of consensus and this variation help explain some of the variation in outcomes and the likelihood of finding mentoring experiences. So some of the studies found that the women of color had had a lot of mentoring experience, some didn't have any, but they also define mentoring differently. And this may also help explain why we have various outcomes on a larger scale when we look at mentoring. Second is in regards to cross-cultural mentoring training. So as I mentioned, there are very conflicting findings about the success of working with mentors of dominant identities. Typically in this case, that was white men. And, mentor identity may be an inconsistent proxy for the actual variable that impacts mentoring fit. So related to the marginality theme, it may be that it's an awareness of power structures in academia that matters and not necessarily the mentor's identity. But folks with more dominant identities may be less likely to see those power structures and less aware of the power structure that women of color have to navigate. So this lends support to calls for cross-cultural mentoring training, research coming out of Wisconsin by Angela Byers-Winston and her colleagues on this topic. Third, we have intersectionality. So there's a lack, part of the reason that the authors would have to fall back on discussing things in a single axis was because there's a lack of research literature that focuses specifically on women of color. So when they're trying to situate their work into a larger field of study, they're talking about women in general, or they're talking about faculty of color in general. This highlights the need for more research that has these breakdowns and looks at these intersections. I also struggled to engage in intersectional analysis of the studies because the studies didn't give a lot of data about the various social identities. And so this adds to the call that we need to include information about various social identities while reporting and data. Now, taking a step back and from a larger level, why does this all matter? There's a dominant narrative that mentoring is really important for women faculty. And I'm not trying to argue that's not true, but it's easy for this to slip and say, well, all you need to succeed as a woman faculty member is mentoring. Now, namely for women of color, this is dangerous because it may be easy to think, I have a mentor or even multiple mentors and I'm not succeeding, so I guess the problem is me, rather than focusing on institutional deficits. So studies such as this help to draw out the nuances of mentoring relationships. They can be challenging and at times problematic. In addition, there are unique challenges that women of color faculty face within academia, and these studies also spoke to that. And so women of color faculty are working within a patriarchal white supremacist institution, and mentoring isn't going to be enough to solve all of that. But this really helps us shift how we think about mentoring and what needs mentoring serves, which hopefully is also useful for folks in designing a faculty mentoring program. So the point isn't to discredit the value of mentoring, but to interrupt that grand narrative and examine the nuances by recentering the focus on women of color. So now what? What does this all mean? And so these are some discussion questions I want to present before I turn it over to the questions that you may have. And these, we can talk about these if you'd like. I'd also like to hope that you walk away and think about these some more. How might mentoring contribute to inequities? When might it actually be problematic? And how can it help facilitate institutional change? And in your own work, you might not be someone who researches mentoring or runs mentoring programs. So in the area that you do specialize in, what are the dominant narratives and assumptions? Whose experiences are being erased? And how might you interrupt this process? So that is my presentation for today, and I'd like to open the floor now to questions.
Thank you so much, Cara. We have a number of different questions from one of our participants that I'll start with. Diotu Isiobu, and please excuse me if I did not pronounce that correctly. Let me know and I'll get it right the next time. I'm going to unmute you so that you can actually have a conversation with Cara here, since you have a number of different questions that I think are really important to talk about here. Are you able to speak to Cara? While we're sorting out the audio there, I'll just vocalize a couple of the questions that were put into the chat box. So one of the questions was, is it known that women of color resist assimilation? And if so, assimilation into what?
So, this study can't fully answer that. I think that at times, yes, at times, no. And so it's assimilation into thinking about, into this power structures within academia. So academia is built for white men. And that is what they're assimilating into, is those power structures, those norms, what we value, what we disregard, what we think is important, how we move through the world, what are the cultural norms. So when we talk about assimilation, I think we're talking about that entire landscape. And I think, whether or not women of color resist assimilation or not is going to be very nuanced and complex and would need to be a different type of study. Mentoring, though, what this research speaks to is that mentoring may help women of color resist assimilation, right? It may empower women of color so they are not being forced to assimilate in order to succeed.
Thank you, Cara. Is your sound working now? It doesn't seem like it. So the second question was, how did the studies reach the conclusion of mentoring when 0 of the participants had no real mentors? Or did I get you wrong?
Oh no, you heard correctly. That was what the authors concluded. It does seem slightly odd. I think part of it was that the authors said they had no mentoring, but that was following a very formal definition of mentoring, this notion of having a senior person in your field who's giving you guidance. And their participants said, well, I didn't have a mentor. In fact, my life would have been a lot easier if I did. And I think, a lot of the participants in this study in both studies were talking about what they wish they could have gotten out of mentoring, what they understand mentoring to provide. And they would also talk about what they provide to their own mentees now that they're in senior positions. And so from that angle, the authors were able to construe that mentoring is still valuable, even though those participants would say that they didn't actually receive mentoring.
Thank you. Another question has to do with your methodology. So does the number of participants have to be many for the study to be meta-analysis, or does meta refer to the number of variables observed or analyzed?
So in a metasynthesis, it means that you're looking at multiple studies. So it's not determining around how many participants are in each individual study or how many variables, but that I'm bringing together multiple studies. There are different approaches to doing a metasynthesis. Some folks do metasyntheses that use up to 100 studies. I was kind of following a line of research and a line of thinking about this where you do approximately 10 studies, so you can really do a deep dive into qualitative analysis of each of those studies.
Great, thank you. And then the last question has to do with your recommendations for what kinds of social data would improve your analysis and conclusions.
I think that there are a lot of areas here to kind of do follow-up work with data, and in an ideal world, I would be able to follow up with the participants of each of these individual studies that I never even conducted in the first place, to ask them to reflect on my findings and do some member checking and see how this resonated with them. I think that there's also one of the benefits of metasynthesis is that it kind of creates this pause. It brings together themes from different qualitative studies. We can look at how those themes fit together and now think about new directions and new studies that can be designed. And so I guess when I hear that question, my first thought is, I have like another dozen studies now I want to design after having done this work. And I think there are a lot of questions that have come up around intersectionality, around working with mentors and dominant identities, to kind of digging into some of that work more clearly in cross-cultural mentoring training.
Great, thank you. So we have another question in the chat box from Shrav saying, thank you. My question is, how can these lessons apply to women graduate students of color? I'm going to try to let this person talk too. So in case there are any follow-up questions, you're able to have a discussion there.
Okay, well, feel free to jump in. That's a great question. And hopefully, I think these lessons really apply a lot, and there are a number of ways to think this through. One of the takeaways from this research and from a lot of the mentoring research is the value of multiple mentors and building yourself a mentoring network. I think something that comes out here and that I was touching on the end, there are conflicting findings around working with mentors of dominant identities. There is research that folks have access to different networks based on their identities. And so what I would say is, it can be useful as a woman of color to have a mentor who might be a white man, because they're going to have access to different networks and different resources. And that can be really useful to you. At the same time, you want to make sure that they are someone who is open to hearing about your personal experience, your social identity, has some cross-cultural awareness, has similar values to you. And so I think it's useful to kind of try out those mentoring relationships and see what's going to work for you. And oftentimes, folks in these studies would talk about the value in finding someone who shared their identity. And if you can't find a senior person, don't think peer mentors can't do the work, because they can, and you can get a lot out of peer mentoring. And so starting a peer mentoring group with other women of color who are graduate students can also be really beneficial.
Thanks, Cara. It looks like Shrav was unable to hear what you said, but we'll try to recap in the text. Another question's coming from Alexandra, who's looking to put on an event about inclusiveness in STEM and is wondering if you have any recommendations for speakers that do this research on this in the Midwest or Chicago area.
There are some really great researchers coming out of, there's a lot of mentoring research coming out of the University of Wisconsin. And so, which is somewhat close, it's in the Midwest, and also Northwestern. So Rick McGee has a lot of research on this. Perhaps, we can follow up and I can get some individual recommendations too, if you want to send me an email. That might be a little bit easier.
Thanks, Cara. So we have another question on how should researchers balance the sharing of identities of participants while also protecting confidentiality of participants, and what practices could the authors of meta-studies use to help?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it's something that a lot of people wrestle with when they're designing studies, and people who want to engage in intersectionality and want to be able to share some of this information, but then also want to protect their participants. One thing is to build it into the research design. So we often take a lot of factors when we think about designing a study and designing the budget and how many people can we afford to include, and what we might not, and we think about this, if it's a quantitative study, for example, how many do we need to include in order to run the tests that we want to run? Well, I would argue that we need to think about intersectionality at that very stage. We need to be embedding it into the very research design. And if we think that through, we can design studies, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, small and large n, that are designed in such a way that we can share social identity information while protecting confidentiality. The specifics of how that design should work is going to really vary based on what your study is, what topic you want to look at. And so I can't necessarily answer that specific question, except to really push that people should be thinking about this from the beginning of their studies. And in terms of practices for meta studies used to help, I think what I think is one of the benefits of a meta study, and what I've done here, is highlighting and showing like there's still this consistent pattern of not providing social identities and not enabling intersectionality. Even in a body of research that's looking specifically at women of color, we still struggle to get that out of there. And so it's a nice reminder that studies need to be including more information and data so we can do intersectional analyses.
Great, thanks. We have, I'm just looking in our chat box that's not in the Q&A. One question is, I want to know what the metasynthesis said about women of color having white men as a mentor.
So, I'm not sure how well the authors came to conclusions on this, but when I was looking in their finding sections, the participants in their studies really had a diverse array of experience. And so there wasn't a distinct conclusion I can say like, oh, it worked, or oh, it didn't work. Some folks would specifically talk about, I had this white man and he was really great. He listened to me, he understood me. He didn't always understand my experience, but he was willing to hear me out. So that ability to be aware that other folks have different experiences than you is really a key factor into being a mentor. They also would sometimes talk that they had access to certain resources or they had a certain degree of power that was really beneficial. At the same time, some of the participants said, yeah, I tried working with a white man. He didn't get it. I would tell him what I was experiencing and he would tell me that wasn't happening. And that was a real challenge. And so I think it's not so much their identity as a white man, but their openness and understanding of social inequities, of power structures, and that cultural competency that's going to really play a role into whether or not they're a good mentor.
We have another question in the Q&A that's from Ania that says, sometimes Asian Americans are separated from other persons of color due to overrepresentation in STEM. Are there any differences that you have observed in your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. There were not a lot of Asian Americans even in my research. And so they were underrepresented in these studies. Going back to that slide, there are a number of studies that specifically were on African American or Black women and one on Native American women. And the ones that were on women of color in general didn't separate out for the most part who was Asian American and who was another racial or ethnic identity. I think only one study did. And so I wasn't able from my analysis point to separate that out because again, they just weren't providing enough social identity information for me to include that.
Another question we have from Lynn is, what methods did you say the studies used? Focus groups, questionnaires? Yeah, so I think they're looking at data collection methods.
Yeah, so all of the studies that were within my study used interviews. Two of them were using a secondary analysis of interview data that had been collected for another purpose, but they all had interview data. And one of them was a combination of open-ended survey responses in addition to follow-up interviews. So it was all qualitative.
Thank you. Follow-up to that, Lynn says, I'm asking because if this was qualitative in any way that text could be mined, could there be quantitative analysis of the data, and would you think this could be useful? And what do you think that it might look like?
I know there are researchers who do that, who take qualitative data and analyze it in a quantitative way. That's definitely outside of my expertise level. I'm sure it could be useful for certain purposes, but that's really beyond my expertise and knowing how to go about doing that or what it would look like.
Another question in the chat box comes from Ivy. My research is in resistance pedagogy regarding the erasure of African civilizations and how dominant narratives regarding this erased history have contributed to inequities for African American students. I'm struck by the parallels in your discussion on mentoring. How appropriate would it be to label teachers as mentors?
Oh, I really enjoy hearing all of that, Ivy. That's great to see those parallels. I'm really interested in that as well. Whether teachers are mentors, that's sort of a debate in a lot of the mentoring research literature. I think teachers can be mentors, but they're not necessarily mentors. In the same way that direct supervisors can be mentors, but they're not necessarily. So sometimes as a teacher, you're imparting information, you're teaching a very specific type of information, but you're not necessarily leading to their overall academic development, and you're not providing that psychosocial support. and this is just my personal opinion, I think the best teachers are also mentors. I think that it's also possible to really develop close mentoring relationships with teachers outside of the classroom. But the way that most classrooms are set up, it can be difficult to develop a mentoring relationship just within a classroom setting.
We have another question in the Q&A. Did anyone examine the issue of access to mentors? Many women of color may not easily get mentors even when they want one. The focus on women of color is great, but even the studies should be more inclusive. This will shed better light on data interpretation. I hope you consider doing that before publishing your work.
Yeah, they all talk about access, and so that's sort of what I was getting at. You know, in the webinar presentation, I didn't get a chance to really dig into this as much as I have in the written analysis, but the degree to which women had access to mentors really varied greatly across the study, and they talked about those challenges. That was kind of some of those challenges I was referring to about finding mentors, finding people who wanted to work with them, broaching them, beginning those relationships, maintain those relationships, and those social identities play a key role in how we begin relationships and how we maintain relationships and how well those relationships function. And so that was really a lot of what these studies were talking about.
Thanks, Cara. It looks like we don't have any other questions, so I will ask my question of you. One is, when I was working as part of the University of Arizona's advanced grant, we did a mentoring study and we used an intersectionality framework for it. And one of the things that was really striking to me was that in certain STEM departments, there was a stigma that was surrounding participating in mentoring programs that disproportionately had a negative impact in terms of evaluation of women of color among the faculty and LGBTQ folks among the faculty, where it was viewed as if participating in a mentoring program meant that you can't hack it on your own, right? That you don't belong because you can't prove it by being independent, right? And there was a clear distinction between the mentoring activities of the majority population versus the marginalized population, where for the majority it was considered to be networking, but for the marginalized population it was called mentoring, right? Yeah. And so I see little trickles of that coming through in what you're talking about here, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more to some of those findings that you had on negative experiences with dysfunctional mentoring relationships or attitude around mentoring that impacted this access question that the previous question was addressing.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I'm still kind of digging into it in my analysis, thinking through the different types of dysfunction. That's a whole nother set of theoretical models around what causes dysfunction in mentoring relationships. And so that's kind of the stage I'm at in the analysis now, is seeing how these findings and themes relate to dysfunctional theories and models. But I do think that, part of what you're saying, Heather, really relates to a larger notion around the culture within STEM, and that there's this culture around the need to be independent, believing that we're individual, independent actors, and that everything is merit-based and fair, and that there's not sort of this like hidden curriculum or things going around. And so it speaks to the need for a cultural shift in STEM, in a lot of STEM fields, that seeking out opportunities for growth is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of being proactive in your career. And so there's a lot there. I think there are a lot of misunderstandings. I know in some of the professional development programs I work with, sometimes folks don't want us to publish their picture on our website because they don't want people at their institution to know they were involved, because it might be looked down upon. Even though it was this amazing professional development program and now they have all these new skills, they're worried that they might be judged for attending. And so I think it just really still speaks to the need that we continue to work on this cultural shift within STEM fields.
Absolutely agree. Now we have a few more questions, which is exciting to see. So Jody asks, one of the dominant narratives is that mentoring is beneficial. Did you gain any insights into how women of color might avoid or overcome less positive mentoring experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of the women did speak to this, some of the participants in some of the studies, that at times, especially early on in their careers, they engage with mentors who are not beneficial to them, who are either competitive with them or who put them down, who treat them poorly. And they spoke of that as one of the key challenges in their career that they had to overcome. And they primarily overcame it by finding better mentors and finding other mentors, because sometimes when they're in that situation, they weren't totally cognizant that it was what was going on or what was aware. I mean, I think for a lot of us, when we first enter in these mentoring experiences in early stages of academia, we don't know what to expect from our mentor. We don't know where to set those expectations. And so if you're mistreated in those early stages, it can be confusing. You're not sure if it's you or if it's them or it's the mentor. And so one of, I think the key aspects for them often was finding peer mentors and finding a really supportive network of peer mentoring. No one in any of the studies had negative things to say about their peer mentoring experiences. The only times that it was negative was when they were working with a senior folk. Sometimes that senior individual was someone who shared their identity. Sometimes it wasn't. Sometimes it was a dominant identity. But in terms of their peer mentoring experiences, they all spoke to really positive ones. And so I think that really helped them to overcome those negative experiences.
Great. Carol says, thank you for laying out the challenges of attempting meta-analyses of mentoring and its impacts, particularly because mentoring is so contextual, frequently ill-defined when the term is used, etc. I'm interested in your thoughts about the extent to which mentoring is prescribed or desired as a fix to women and people of color, which puts the most of the onus on those women and underrepresented people of color to assimilate to the cultures that are fundamentally biased and unwelcome.
Yeah, so I mean, this is something I think about a lot, and wanting to make sure that we're shifting from thinking about individual deficits to institutional deficits, and that what we really need to be changing are institutions. And this is something that I think the studies did a nice job of speaking to and responding to that concern. And they would talk about, yes, we need institutional change. And in the meantime, we need to provide women of color with a tool to resist and a tool to survive in these uncomfortable and antagonistic climates. And so I think mentoring can be seen as that. I think mentoring can also be seen, and some of the studies also spoke to this, as a way to transform institutions. And this notion of, if they're getting a type of mentoring that is not all about assimilation, but is simply about empowerment and career advancement, then as they move into senior positions, as they start to mentor others, they're able to kind of change the culture. They're able to change structures. And the studies really dig into that. I only briefly touched on that in today's talk, but that's something I'm really interested in kind of digging into more as I start to write up some of this research.
Great. So the next question is, so what's the next step?
That's a great question that I struggle with on a daily basis in terms of my life. I think at this point, as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, I'm really interested in kind of diving into a little bit of the theoretical models around dysfunction in mentoring, because I've been looking a lot at benefits and definitions, and also intersectionality. And to really make this well-rounded, we also want to think about dysfunctions and what this speaks to about when things go wrong, why things go wrong, because I think that this study has a lot to say about that, and I haven't had a chance yet to look at that body of literature. So that's my immediate next step.
This next question from Claire kind of follows nicely from that. So if you were imagining an article that addresses the gaps that you found in the research, what would it focus on? And what do you think is the most important gap to fill?
I really think that at this point, we need to figure out exactly what mentoring is. So, because if we're all using different definitions, then we're all going to keep finding different outcomes, and we're still not going to know what works and what doesn't work. And so there is research going on right now, and this is not my area of expertise, but this is specifically folks who do like a lot of advanced survey design and factor analysis to try and distinguish between concepts. I know that there's been one model that was tested with 11 distinct functions of mentoring, and then that didn't find any support in the actual data once they collected it. But just trying to clarify what some of this, what we mean when we say mentoring. What is it? What are we talking about it? What function does it serve? If we can narrow in and agree on definition, I think it's going to really help every other aspect of research surrounding mentoring.
Another question asks about Let's see. Did you see a difference between formal and informal mentoring experiences? For example, programs set up through an advanced grant with assigned mentors and mentees rather than the organic development and mentoring relationships?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. One thing that happened was with the formal programs, it often gave people access to mentoring when they were struggling to have access to mentors previously. So women of color, as you know, we've been discussing throughout this discussion section, often have less access to finding mentors and really struggle to find mentors and folks who want to work with them, folks who have their identity. And so these formal mentoring experiences can often give them access to mentors that they didn't have otherwise. And so in that way, it's really helpful. In terms of the actual benefits of mentoring, I didn't notice a difference. So once they got a mentoring relationship, whether it was formal or informal, there was no consistent difference about the outcomes. But I think it was more about an issue of access.
This next question has to do with terminology in these types of studies. And is it best to talk about networking rather than mentoring? And I'd add a follow-up to that is, how would you distinguish the difference between the two?
So I'm not sure of those of you on this webinar right now, how many of you were able to attend Dr. Ethel Mickey's webinar? She's the other virtual visiting fellow right now, and her research is around networking. She did metasynthesis of networking research. And Ethel and I have been meeting throughout the past year to discuss our work with each other and discuss the fact that these concepts overlap a great deal. And they're not clearly distinguished. And this goes back to the struggle with this murky definition of mentoring. And I think that as mentoring and the research around it has progressed, it's progressed to be more towards a networking model because we think now about mentoring as a networking phenomenon. However, there are also networking connections that you have that you don't receive mentoring through. And there are, when I think about people in my network, they're not all mentors to me, and I'm not necessarily mentors to them, but they are maybe just modes of access to information or to resources, which is a little bit different than I would say mentoring. But I think that the literature is also still really struggling with that distinction.
Let's see here. Christine offered a thought on one of the questions that we covered earlier, and it's around language. So the concept of calling women of color part of a marginalized population, and can that create a biased perspective when we're talking about this and have an impact on, you know, how people are thinking about women of color and their role and participation in a discipline or department or a mentoring program?
Yeah, I mean, I think language is really important. The words that we use hold a lot of power. They can be tools of oppression, they can be tools of freedom. And so really thinking through what terms we're using, when and why we're choosing to use that term. So are we going to talk about a group being underrepresented because it just has to do with a numerical situation? There's not enough of that group. Are we going to talk about a systemically marginalized population in which that is a population that has historically been oppressed and excluded? And so I think I don't think there's a right and wrong term for a lot of these, but I think that it's important that people be intentional about which term they're using, in which context, and why, and to try to really make those distinctions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Looks like we have time for one more question here before we wrap up. So let's see here. Porva says, we're looking for mentors for specific racial and ethnic groups. How would you suggest structuring questions based on cultural differences of participants? How would you evaluate the program overlooking the cultural differences, if any, between mentors and mentees and ensure that the program has a great impact? This is more of a programmatic design and evaluation kind of question.
Yeah. I think that if you look to a lot of the publications that are already put out by folks who have done advanced mentoring programs, you might be able to find some of those answers to those questions, especially around like the evaluation metrics. Also, the research that's coming out of Wisconsin by Chris Pfund and Angela Byers-Winston and their colleagues also speaks to some of, I think, what you're looking for, and they have some published metrics around cross-cultural mentoring that might be very useful to you. You can also feel free to follow up with me via email, and we can get into more of a conversation around evaluation metrics. It's something that I kind of do in another area of my life outside of research, and so I'm happy to answer more questions around that.
Great. And it looks like we have one last question, so I'm going to ask it, and if people need to leave, they can leave, and we'll record it, and they can view it later. So this question is from Shannon, saying, what groups or people who represent people of color are being consulted to help analyze your research to ensure the interpretation is indeed centered around people of color? How did you decide what areas or people to interview, and how diverse was the result? And this person noted that they joined a little late, so may have missed some of the pieces that you mentioned on methodology.
Sure, so I didn't actually interview people. I was using studies that had already been conducted. So in a metasynthesis, I had a very structured approach to gathering together a data set of existing studies, all of which centered women of color and their experiences. And so that was really the basis of that. In terms of consulting to help analyze my research and interpretation, I haven't quite gotten to do a lot of that yet, although I have been disseminating in a number of venues and doing presentations and consulting with some of my collaborators to help work with this. Because I don't have a direct access to a data set, because it's a meta study, I can't do member checking quite the traditional way. And so it's a little different. But hopefully folks give me a lot of feedback when I'm presenting, and I'm trying to take in that feedback and be very receptive as much as I can.
And I'd also add that you've worked really closely with the ARC Network Research Board that has a bunch of different researchers on it to give feedback throughout your analysis. So yeah, yes. Great. And then as part of that same question, are microaggressions addressed? And we talked about the negative mentoring experiences for people of color, especially if they endure any kind of violence through their experience. So this question's asking if there are any kind of data splits in the studies that you looked at to compare the vulnerability of different populations at different intersections.
Yeah, you know, as I was mentioning earlier, I can't split them up because the studies themselves don't provide enough information. And so that's really what I would love to do. The focus of much of my research on intersectionality and the need for intersectional research approaches. But because I'm using studies that were previously conducted and published, it's a meta study, they're not providing enough information for me to really make those distinctions.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much, Cara, for this really engaging conversation and for sharing your work with the community. Coming up very soon on October 6th, 7th, and 8th, we're having our ARC Network community convening, and Cara and our other virtual visiting scholar, Ethel Mickey, are presenting together in a symposium there, which is really exciting. So for those of you who are coming, you'll have more of a chance to interact with Cara and to learn more about her work and to talk with Ethel as well. Thank you all for coming to this meeting today and learning about this work, and we will send a follow-up email soon with links to the recording and any other additional materials that Cara may want to share based on the kinds of questions that were asked today.
And thank you all for this feedback and for these questions. It's really given me a lot to think about, and it's been very helpful.